Hi guys, tonight we begin a calm yet extraordinary journey into the life of Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt. She was not only a queen, but a strategist, a diplomat, and a woman whose presence altered the course of empires. In this story, you'll hear about her rise to power, her legendary intelligence, and the choices that shaped history. But before we begin, for those who enjoy slow, thoughtful stories about legendary figures, hit like, subscribe, and share in the comments which personality or historical figure you'd like me to cover next. And tell me, where are you watching from? I'm always curious to see the different places my viewers are from. So let's step quietly into her world and uncover the destiny she carried. Cleopatra was born in 69 BCE into the ruling dynasty of the Ptolemies, a family of Greek origin who had controlled Egypt since the time of Alexander the Great. Unlike many of her ancestors who clung to Greek customs, Cleopatra chose a different path. She embraced the Egyptian language, rituals, and the gods of the Nile. This was not a simple gesture. It was a calculated decision to connect with the people she would one day rule, making her more than just another monarch on the throne. The early years of her life were spent in the royal palace of Alexandria, a city glittering with marble, knowledge, and wealth. Alexandria was home to the Great Library, where scrolls from across the known world were collected, and to the lighthouse of Pharos, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Surrounded by such grandeur, Cleopatra grew up in an atmosphere of culture and ambition. Yet beneath this brilliance lay turmoil. The Ptolemaic dynasty was riddled with family rivalries, betrayals, and assassinations. The throne of Egypt was a dangerous seat, and survival meant mastering both cunning and courage. From a young age, Cleopatra was trained in philosophy, rhetoric, and politics. She could speak several languages, including Greek, Egyptian, and reportedly even the tongues of surrounding nations. This gift of communication would become one of her most powerful tools in ruling an empire divided between tradition and foreign influence. Her father, Ptolemy Thulth, often struggled to keep Egypt's independence intact while Rome grew stronger each year. Cleopatra witnessed the constant pressure her father faced from Roman generals and politicians, who looked at Egypt not just as a neighbour, but as a prize. Watching these struggles, she learned that Egypt's survival would depend not only on wealth or armies, but also on the art of negotiation. When her father passed away, Cleopatra was thrust into the storm of succession. She was not yet 20 years old, yet she already knew the weight of destiny that rested on her shoulders. She would rule alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, as was the custom. But harmony was far from guaranteed. The royal court became a place of whispers and plots, with advisors and guardians pushing the young king to sideline his sister. Cleopatra, however, was not a woman to be pushed aside. She began to assert herself as the true ruler, issuing decrees with her name alone and appearing as the living goddess Isis, a symbol of Egypt's strength. These actions, bold and unprecedented, deepened the rift between her and her brother's supporters. Conflict grew, and soon Cleopatra found herself forced to flee the palace, stripped of her power and abandoned by those she thought loyal. Yet even in exile, she carried with her not despair but determination. She knew that her story was far from over and that destiny still called her back to the Nile's throne. This first chapter of her life shows us a young woman already marked by resilience, vision, and a profound sense of her role in history. The journey has only begun, and with each step we will see how Cleopatra's choices reshaped not only Egypt, but the fate of an empire. Cleopatra's exile from Alexandria was not the end of her story, but the beginning of her rise. Cast out of the palace by the advisors who backed her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, she retreated to the eastern deserts of Egypt. Here, away from the marble halls and bustling streets of Alexandria, she gathered her strength and plotted her return. The land may have seemed desolate, but Cleopatra found allies among the tribes and mercenaries who respected her willpower and her vision. Even in those harsh conditions, she carried herself not as a fallen queen, but as one destined to return. She understood that Egypt was too important to Rome for her to be ignored, and soon fate itself would bring her into contact with the one man whose arrival would change everything, Julius Caesar. At this moment, Rome loomed over the Mediterranean world like a restless giant. Its armies had conquered territories from Gaul to Greece, and its leaders quarrelled over supreme power. When Caesar entered Egypt in pursuit of his rival Pompey, he stepped into the tangled web of the Ptolemaic court. Ptolemy Thirteen had aligned with Pompey, but the alliance ended in tragedy when Pompey was murdered on Egyptian soil, leaving Caesar both horrified and determined to restore order. Cleopatra recognized this as her opportunity. She knew that Caesar valued intelligence and boldness, and so she devised a daring plan to meet him face to face. The story goes that Cleopatra had herself smuggled into the palace, rolled inside a carpet, or perhaps a linen sack which was carried into Caesar's quarters. When the bundle was unrolled, the young queen appeared before him, unarmed but radiant with charm and courage. This moment became legendary, a symbol of her audacity and theatrical genius. Cleopatra did not merely beg for help. She presented herself as the rightful ruler, intelligent and capable, someone whose destiny aligned with the stability Caesar sought in Egypt. Caesar, captivated by her presence and aware of the strategic importance of supporting her, agreed to back her claim to the throne. What followed was not a simple restoration, but a war within Alexandria itself. Cleopatra and Caesar stood against Ptolemy Thuthus and his supporters, and the city became a battlefield. Fires spread, ships burned, and amidst the chaos, part of the great library may have been destroyed, though the truth of this loss remains debated. Through it all, Cleopatra showed courage and resilience, standing beside Caesar not only as an ally but as a partner in the struggle. Eventually, Ptolemy Thene was defeated, reportedly drowning in the Nile during the retreat. Cleopatra, still only in her early 20s, was restored as queen, now ruling alongside another younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, though the real power was hers. Her relationship with Caesar was both political and personal. Together they symbolized an alliance between Egypt and Rome, a bond that would secure her throne for the moment. Cleopatra bore Caesar a son, Ptolemy XV, known as Caesarion, whom she hoped would one day unite the legacies of Egypt and Rome, though Caesar could not openly acknowledge him in Rome's strict political climate. In Alexandria, the child was celebrated as a symbol of a new dawn. For Cleopatra, this was more than survival. It was the crafting of a legacy, one that reached beyond her own lifetime. As the years passed, Cleopatra ruled with increasing confidence. She presided over Egypt's wealth, its trade, and its temples, ensuring that the Nile's bounty continued to flow. She portrayed herself not just as a monarch but as a living goddess, embodying Isis, the mother and protector. Her court became a place where learning, culture, and power intertwined. Yet even in her triumph, she knew that Caesar's support was the shield protecting her reign. And as long as the tides of Roman politics shifted, her future remained uncertain. This chapter of her life reveals Cleopatra's gift for turning danger into opportunity. Exiled and betrayed, she returned not through force alone but through intelligence, daring, and the ability to recognize destiny when it appeared at her door. Her story was no longer confined to Egypt. It had become entangled with the fate of Rome itself. After her restoration to the throne, Cleopatra entered a new chapter defined by both triumph and fragility. Though she'd regained her crown with Caesar's aid, she understood that the security of Egypt was tethered to the will of Rome. In Alexandria, she ruled with poise, cultivating an image of divinity and authority, while carefully balancing her role as both sovereign and partner to Caesar. The birth of Caesarion gave her a sense of continuity, a dream that Egypt might endure through the veins of a child who carried the blood of both worlds. Within her palace, statues and inscriptions celebrated her as Isis incarnate, mother of the air, protector of Egypt. These symbols were not vanity alone. They were a reminder to her people that Egypt was still sovereign and that its queen was no mere shadow of Rome. Yet even as she governed, whispers of uncertainty drifted across the Mediterranean. Caesar's return to Rome meant distance, and in his absence Cleopatra maintained her grip on power with the same sharp intelligence that had carried her through exile. She consolidated Egypt's wealth, ensuring the granaries remained full and trade routes alive, knowing that stability at home would fortify her position abroad. She also worked to strengthen her image among her subjects, presenting herself not as a foreign Greek ruler, but as a pharaoh in the truest Egyptian sense. She conducted religious ceremonies, wore traditional regalia, and stood beneath the temple's sacred columns as if she had been born of the Nile itself. For the people, this blending of Ptolemaic and Egyptian traditions gave her legitimacy no ruler of her line had embraced so fully before. Meanwhile, her connection with Caesar became the subject of fascination and controversy. In Rome, many senators frowned upon the queen's influence, seeing her not as a partner, but as a threat. Rumours travelled faster than armies, painting Cleopatra as a temptress, a woman who sought to ensnare the mighty Caesar for her own ends. Cleopatra, however, remained serene in the face of such stories. She knew that perception was a weapon, and in Egypt she wielded it skillfully. To her people she was not merely Caesar's consort, but their sovereign, chosen by the gods to rule. When Caesar invited her to Rome, she journeyed with Caesarion, arriving in a city both fascinated and unsettled by her presence. Draped in luxury and accompanied by her entourage, she became the embodiment of Egypt itself, a foreign queen walking the streets of the Republic. While some admired her grace and intellect, others viewed her with suspicion, fearing the sway she held over Caesar's heart and decisions. It was during this time that Cleopatra witnessed firsthand the immense power and tensions tearing Rome apart. She saw the Senate divided, the people restless, and the ambition of men threatening to unravel the very fabric of the Republic. For Cleopatra, it was a reminder that her own throne rested on fragile foundations. Caesar's protection was vital, but his life was no less vulnerable to the daggers of rivals than her own had been to palace conspiracies. And so she observed quietly, learning once more how power ebbed and flowed, and how empires could shift in a single moment. Her return to Egypt after her Roman sojourn marked the beginning of a period of calm prosperity. But beneath the calm waters of the Nile, Cleopatra surely sensed that storms were gathering, both in Rome and in her own destiny. She had secured survival, but survival alone was never her goal. Her gaze was fixed on legacy, on shaping Egypt into more than a fading relic of the past. She was determined that her reign would not be remembered as the twilight of a dynasty, but as its final brilliant blaze before the night. Cleopatra's years after returning from Rome were marked by a delicate balancing act. She had walked through the heart of the Republic and witnessed both its grandeur and its instability, and she returned to Alexandria with a renewed sense of how fragile alliances could be. Egypt, though prosperous under her rule, was always watched by Rome, its granaries and wealth too valuable to be ignored. Cleopatra responded by strengthening her position at home. She invested in temples, honouring the gods with processions that tied her rule to sacred tradition. She oversaw the trade routes flowing through the Red Sea and Mediterranean, making Egypt a hub of commerce. Merchants carried spices, silks, and grain. Their goods a reminder that Egypt was not merely a pawn, but a vital artery of wealth. At court, she surrounded herself with scholars, philosophers, and healers, ensuring that Alexandria remained a beacon of learning. These years, though peaceful, were underscored by an unspoken awareness that Caesar's shadow loomed large. His letters and envoys reminded her that her position was secured by his favour, yet his struggles in Rome grew more dangerous. The Senate seethed with resentment toward him, and Cleopatra surely sensed that his enemies sharpened their knives. Then came the fateful news. Caesar had been assassinated on the Ides of March in 44 BCE. Cleopatra's protector, Ali, and the father of her son was gone, struck down in the Senate by men who feared his power. For Cleopatra, the loss was devastating not only personally but politically. She understood immediately that without Caesar, her future and Caesarion's claim were threatened. Rome would not unite around the boy she declared heir. Instead, it would fracture into yet another civil war. And so she returned fully to Egypt, carrying with her the memory of Caesar and the challenge of raising Caesarion as a symbol of continuity. She had him proclaimed co-ruler, his small figure depicted on coins beside her own, a statement that the bloodline of Caesar lived in Egypt. Still, she knew Rome's generals would not accept this without question. Mark Antony and Octavian, Caesar's chosen heir, were rising to prominence, and their rivalry would shape not only Rome's destiny but her own. Cleopatra waited, cautious yet prepared, knowing that soon she would have to decide which Roman to trust. Her throne, her child, and her legacy all rested upon that choice. In the turbulent months after Caesar's death, Cleopatra found herself navigating a world where every decision carried immense risk. Rome had plunged into chaos, with Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, and Mark Antony, his loyal general, rising as the dominant figures. Both men commanded loyalty, both sought power, and both would shape the future of the Republic. Cleopatra, far away in Alexandria, watched closely as alliances formed and shattered across the Mediterranean. She understood that Egypt's survival depended on choosing the right ally, yet she also knew that hasty decisions could endanger her throne. For a time, she strengthened her own kingdom, focusing on Caesarion and maintaining stability within Egypt's borders. She issued decrees that emphasized her son's lineage, presenting him not only as her co-ruler, but as Caesar's living heir. The message was clear. Egypt was not dependent on Rome, but held within it a piece of Rome's destiny. Still, she could not remain detached for long. The tides of Roman conflict soon pulled her into their current. Mark Antony, having taken command of the eastern provinces, summoned Cleopatra to answer accusations that she had failed to support Rome's cause. To ignore the summons would be dangerous, but to submit meekly would betray her strength. Cleopatra chose a path that reflected her character, one of boldness and spectacle. When she sailed to meet Antony at Tarsus in 41 BCE, she transformed her arrival into legend. Her ship glided up the river adorned with purple sails, golden oars, and musicians playing softly, as if the goddess Isis herself had descended upon the waters. Cleopatra reclined beneath a canopy, surrounded by attendants dressed as divine figures, and the scent of incense drifted over the waves. It was not merely a display of wealth, but of power, culture, and allure. Antony, a man known for his love of grandeur and excess, was captivated. In that moment, Cleopatra redefined their relationship, not as a queen summoned by a Roman general, but as a sovereign who met him as an equal. The two forged an alliance that was both political and personal, their bond sealed by shared ambition and the intoxicating atmosphere of Alexandria when Antony followed her there. Together, they indulged in feasts, laughter, and the blending of Roman might with Egyptian splendor. Yet beneath the revelry lay strategy. Cleopatra saw in Antony a protector for her throne and a partner in preserving Egypt's independence. Antony, for his part, found in her not only charm but resources, wealth that could fund his campaigns, and a queen whose intelligence matched his own. For Cleopatra, this union was not mere romance. It was survival, crafted with the same deliberate vision that had guided her from exile to power. She had chosen, and with that choice, her fate became bound to Antony's struggle against Octavian. Cleopatra's alliance with Mark Antony blossomed into one of the most famous partnerships in history. Yet at its core it was built on strategy as much as affection. In Alexandria, their union became the subject of fascination. Together they held extravagant banquets where myth and politics merged, Antony appearing as the god Dionysus and Cleopatra as Isis, weaving divine imagery into their earthly rule. These spectacles, though ridiculed by some, were not mere indulgence. They served as declarations that Egypt was not a client state, but a kingdom with its own grandeur, its own gods, and a queen whose power could rival Rome's. For Cleopatra, every feast was a performance of sovereignty. Beyond the golden halls, their partnership had real consequences. Antony, seeking to strengthen his position in the east, relied on Egypt's wealth to support his military campaigns. Cleopatra, in turn, received territories once belonging to Egypt, lands that expanded her influence along the eastern Mediterranean. This restoration of ancient borders gave her a sense of fulfilling destiny, presenting her not simply as a survivor, but as a restorer of Egypt's glory. Their relationship also produced children, twins named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and later a son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. These children symbolized a merging of dynasties, Egyptian and Roman, and Cleopatra surely envisioned a future where their union would secure peace and stability. Yet such dreams faced constant threat from Octavian, who in Rome painted their bond as dangerous. He portrayed Antony as a Roman corrupted by the charms of a foreign queen, suggesting that Cleopatra sought to dominate not only Egypt but Rome itself. Propaganda became a weapon, and Cleopatra, thousands of miles away, became a figure of suspicion and scorn among Rome's citizens. Still, in Alexandria she and Antony thrived. They created a miniature court of gods and rulers where love and politics intertwined. Cleopatra remained focused, knowing that the power of Rome could never be ignored. She encouraged Antony's campaigns, provided resources, and stood by him as partner and queen. Yet she also prepared for the storms ahead, aware that Octavian's ambitions would one day bring conflict. For now, though, she ruled in splendour, her throne secure, her children growing, and her vision of Egypt's renewal alive. Each step she took with Antony carried both promise and peril, binding her destiny ever more tightly to his. As the years with Antony unfolded, Cleopatra's ambitions grew clearer. She was no longer content to simply preserve Egypt as a client ally of Rome. She envisioned a realm restored to its ancient prestige, strengthened by her children who carried both Egyptian and Roman blood. To this end, she supported Antony in his eastern campaigns, providing ships, supplies, and wealth in exchange for the return of territories once lost. With each success, her influence extended beyond the Nile, reaching into Syria, Cyprus, and parts of modern-day Lebanon. In Alexandria, these victories were celebrated as signs of divine favour, with Cleopatra and Antony presiding like gods reborn. Yet the very scale of their partnership fueled Octavian's propaganda in Rome. He told the Senate that Antony had fallen under the queen's spell, that he sought to abandon Rome and rule the world from Alexandria at her side. These accusations, though exaggerated, found eager ears among Romans weary of civil strife and suspicious of foreign rulers. Cleopatra, however, remained undaunted. She staged ceremonies in which Antony declared their children rulers of new lands, crowning Alexander Helios, king of Armenia, and Cleopatra, Selene, queen of Cyrene. Such acts proclaimed to the world that a new dynasty was rising, one that might eclipse Octavian's claim to power. Cleopatra's presence in these ceremonies was deliberate. She appeared as Isis, her children as heirs of gods and kings. For the people of Egypt, these displays reinforced her legitimacy. For Rome, they became proof of her supposed ambition to dismantle the Republic. In private, Cleopatra balanced the roles of mother and monarch. She guided her children with the same careful foresight that marked her reign, instilling in them the sense that they were born not only to inherit a throne, but to carry forward a vision of uniting East and West. Antony, charmed by the grandeur of her vision, often indulged her plans, though his position within Rome grew increasingly fragile. Every banquet, every proclamation in Alexandria became another weapon Octavian could use against them. The bond between Cleopatra and Antony was thus both their strength and their greatest vulnerability. As Octavian tightened his grip on power in Rome, Cleopatra surely sensed the path ahead would lead to confrontation. But for the moment, within the marble halls of Alexandria, surrounded by children and courtiers, she still reigned in splendour, a queen who dared to dream beyond the horizon, shaping her empire's destiny with each calculated step. The tension between Antony and Octavian soon grew into open rivalry, and Cleopatra found herself at the very centre of a struggle that would determine the future of the Mediterranean world. In Egypt, she prepared for the inevitable by ensuring her navy was strong, her coffers full, and her people reminded of her divine role. Temples across the Nile displayed her image as Isis, mother and protector, while in the harbour of Alexandria her ships waited, painted and provisioned. Antony, drawn deeper into her vision, made Alexandria his base, a choice that alarmed his allies in Rome and gave Octavian yet more fuel for his accusations. To many Romans, Antony seemed less a general of the Republic than a king in thrall to a queen. Cleopatra understood the danger of this perception, yet she also saw the opportunity. If Antony triumphed over Octavian, their children would inherit not only Egypt but influence over Rome itself. The stakes were immense, and so she committed herself fully to his cause. In 32 BCE, Octavian declared war, not on Antony alone, but on Cleopatra, framing the conflict as Rome's defence against a foreign queen. This was a masterstroke of politics, turning Antony's Roman supporters against him by casting Cleopatra as the true enemy. For Cleopatra, the declaration was a moment of clarity. The struggle was no longer merely Antony's, it was hers, Egypt's very survival bound to the outcome. The decisive confrontation came at Actium in 31 BCE, a naval battle on the western coast of Greece. Cleopatra sailed at Antony's side with her fleet, her flagship shining with gilded prows, her sailors trained and ready. Yet despite their preparations, the battle turned against them. Octavian's forces, led by the skilled Agrippa, trapped their ships and cut off their supplies. As the fighting raged, Cleopatra made a fateful choice. She withdrew her fleet through a gap in the enemy line, and Antony, seeing her retreat, followed. Their departure broke the morale of their forces, leaving the rest of the fleet to collapse. Actium was a disaster, and with it the dream of uniting Rome and Egypt under their children's future crowns began to fade. Yet even in defeat, Cleopatra remained determined. She returned to Alexandria, gathering her remaining resources, strengthening the city's defences, and planning for the inevitable arrival of Octavian's legions. The queen, who had once been exiled as a young woman, now faced the greatest trial of her reign, resolved to defend both her throne and her legacy against the rising power of Rome. After the defeat at Actium, Cleopatra returned to Alexandria carrying the heavy weight of shattered hopes yet refusing to surrender. The city became her fortress, its harbours filled with the remnants of her fleet and its walls bristling with defences. Within the palace she worked tirelessly to secure allies, sending envoys to distant kingdoms in search of support. Few answered, for Octavian's star was rising, and many rulers feared his wrath more than they desired Egypt's friendship. Still, Cleopatra did not despair. She turned her focus inward, ensuring the loyalty of her subjects and preserving the splendour of Alexandria. Markets bustled, scholars continued their studies, and temples echoed with prayers, as if to remind the people that Egypt still stood proud beneath her rule. Beside her, Antony struggled with despair. His reputation in Rome lay in ruins, his armies dwindled, and his sense of honour fractured. Cleopatra, however, never ceased to project strength. She comforted him when he faltered and urged him to see that their cause was not yet lost. Together they staged ceremonies to reinforce their authority, presenting themselves as gods upon earth, symbols of resilience against Rome's tightening grip. Yet beneath the grandeur, Cleopatra began to weave new strategies. She secretly reached out to Octavian, seeking terms that might preserve her throne, or at least protect Caesarion, her son by Caesar. Her letter spoke not as a defeated queen, but as a ruler bargaining from dignity, offering wealth and loyalty in exchange for mercy. Octavian, cold and calculating, entertained these messages but revealed little of his intent. For him, the war had always been framed as a battle against Cleopatra, and her downfall was essential to his narrative. Still, Cleopatra persisted, knowing that diplomacy was her only chance where arms had failed. In the summer of 30 BCE, Octavian marched toward Alexandria. His legions, disciplined and vast, advanced with the inevitability of a tide. Cleopatra watched from her palace as dust rose on the horizon, understanding that the final confrontation of her life was at hand. She fortified the city, encouraged her soldiers, and prepared her treasures. But in her heart she must have known the struggle could not be won. Yet even in that knowledge, she remained determined to control her own destiny. She would not allow her reign, her image, or her legacy to be defined solely by Rome. In those final days, as Alexandria braced for siege, Cleopatra's resolve was unbroken. She stood as the last pharaoh of Egypt, defiant, regal, and unyielding in the face of empire. As Octavian's legions pressed closer to Alexandria, the city's atmosphere shifted from splendor to dread. Cleopatra, ever the strategist, did not yield to despair. Instead, she focused on controlling the narrative of her final stand. She ordered her treasuries secured, her ships prepared, and her loyal court gathered. Within the palace walls she remained composed, carrying herself as Isis embodied, a queen whose divine presence was meant to steady her people even as the enemy approached. Antony, meanwhile, wrestled with his failing spirit. Defeat at Actium had wounded his pride beyond repair, and whispers of desertion among his soldiers deepened his despair. Cleopatra, seeing his decline, tried to rally him with her own strength, but even her determination could not shield him from the truth. Octavian's power was too great. Yet Cleopatra refused to let resignation define her. She continued negotiating with Octavian through secret messengers, offering tribute and pledging loyalty if he would spare her throne. She spoke not only of wealth, but of stability, presenting herself as the one who could keep Egypt prosperous under Rome's shadow. Octavian listened, but his ambition was clear. He did not seek alliance, he sought submission. Antony, realizing her correspondence, grew uneasy, but Cleopatra's loyalty to him remained. Her letters were acts of survival, not betrayal. As Rome's forces closed in, Alexandria became a city suspended between grandeur and ruin. Its streets still echoed with the chatter of merchants and the songs of priests, but fear lingered in every corner. Cleopatra's children stayed within the palace, their futures uncertain, their mother determined to protect them at any cost. When Octavian finally reached the city, the conflict that followed was swift and merciless. Antony attempted one last stand, gathering the remnants of his forces for battle outside Alexandria's walls. Cleopatra, watching from the palace, must have felt the weight of inevitability pressing down upon her. The clash ended in Antony's defeat, his soldiers scattering, his honour shattered. Believing Cleopatra had already taken her own life to avoid capture, Antony fell on his sword, a tragic gesture meant to reclaim dignity in the face of loss. Mortally wounded, he was carried to Cleopatra, who was still alive, waiting within her mausoleum. There, in a chamber filled with treasure and the scent of incense, they shared their final moments. Cleopatra, stricken with grief, held him as he died, their fates forever entwined. The Queen of Egypt had lost her partner, her ally, and the father of her children. Yet even in this moment of heartbreak, she turned her mind to what must come next. Octavian was in Alexandria, and her destiny, along with that of Egypt, hung in the balance. Cleopatra, now alone after Antony's death, faced the most perilous days of her reign. Octavian had entered Alexandria, his legions stationed throughout the city, his authority pressing down upon the last independent throne of Egypt. Yet Cleopatra did not crumble. Instead, she retreated into the mausoleum she had prepared long before, a fortress-like sanctuary filled with gold, jewels, and treasures of dynasties past. It was both a tomb and a bargaining tool, for she wished Octavian to know that if he sought to humiliate her, she would deny him Egypt's riches by burning them. Within those walls, she received envoys from Octavian, listening calmly to their demands. He promised her safety, spoke of sparing her children, and hinted at clemency, but Cleopatra knew the ways of conquerors. Octavian did not intend to let her rule. He intended to parade her through Rome in chains, a trophy for his triumph. The thought of such humiliation, of being displayed as a captive queen, filled her with dread, for she had built her life upon sovereignty and dignity. Cleopatra sought another path, she attempted to negotiate directly, requesting that Caesarion, her son with Julius Caesar, be allowed to inherit some measure of authority. To Octavian, however, the boy was a threat, a living rival with Caesar's blood, and such a future could not be permitted. Cleopatra sensed the danger, though she still clung to the hope that her children might be spared. In these final days she adorned herself in her finest robes, appearing before Octavian's envoys with the bearing of a goddess. Her eyes conveyed defiance, her words carried grace, and even in captivity she maintained the aura of a ruler untouched by fear. To those around her, it was clear she was determined to shape her own ending. She dined with her attendants, consulted her scholars, and walked among her children, imprinting upon them the weight of their heritage. All the while she prepared inwardly for the moment when choice would replace fate. The memory of Antony lingered in her heart, and the reality of Octavian's ambition grew sharper with each passing hour. Cleopatra understood that her death would mark not only the end of her reign, but the end of Egypt as an independent kingdom. And yet she also knew that how she chose to leave the world would echo for centuries. To die as a captive was unthinkable. To die as a queen was her final act of sovereignty. Within the quiet of her mausoleum, surrounded by symbols of eternity, Cleopatra began to plan her last performance. One final gesture to shape destiny, to claim agency where conquest sought to erase it, and to ensure that even in defeat, the last Pharaoh of Egypt would be remembered not as a prisoner, but as a ruler who chose her own end. In the stillness of her mausoleum, Cleopatra began to orchestrate her final act with the same precision that had guided her life. She understood that her choices would define not only how she was remembered, but how her people would perceive the end of their dynasty. To submit to Octavian's triumph was to erase her sovereignty, to reduce Egypt's queen to a symbol of Rome's conquest. To end her life on her own terms was to reclaim control, transforming defeat into dignity. The queen consulted her most trusted attendants, women who had stood beside her through years of glory and decline. Together they prepared the chamber, filling it with offerings, incense, and the treasures of the Ptolemies. Cleopatra adorned herself in royal robes, draped with jewels and gold, the image of Isis alive one final time. The scene was not one of despair, but of ceremony, as if she were stepping into eternity rather than abandoning the world. Historians have long debated the means of her death. Ancient writers spoke of a venomous asp hidden in a basket of figs, its bite swift and lethal, a serpent chosen for its sacred symbolism in Egyptian belief. Others suggest she used poison prepared by her physicians, a blend crafted with her knowledge of science and medicine. Whatever the truth, the act was deliberate, calculated, and deeply symbolic. The asp, if it was indeed her choice, represented not only death but rebirth, the cycle of life tied to Egypt's spiritual traditions. As Cleopatra prepared, she embraced her role as both queen and symbol. Her attendants, loyal to the end, shared in her decision, ensuring that her will was carried out. To the Romans outside she remained untouchable. To the Egyptians within she remained divine. When the moment came, she accepted it calmly, her gaze steady, her figure regal, her final breath an act of defiance against humiliation. Word of her death reached Octavian swiftly. For him, it was a mixture of triumph and frustration. He had secured Egypt without parading her as a captive, yet Cleopatra's choice denied him the spectacle he craved. Instead, she entered history on her own terms, her final gesture a reminder that even Rome's power could not strip her of agency. With Cleopatra's passing, Egypt ceased to be an independent kingdom. Octavian absorbed it into his growing empire, using its wealth to cement his position as Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. Caesarion, the boy Cleopatra had fought to protect, was executed soon after, ensuring that no rival to Augustus's rule remained. Her other children were taken to Rome, their lives spared but their futures bound by the politics of a foreign land. And yet, despite conquest and tragedy, Cleopatra's story did not fade. Her death became legend, her image immortalized in art, poetry, and memory. She was the last pharaoh, the queen who embraced the gods, who wielded intellect and charm as weapons, and who faced her end not in chains, but with the pride of a ruler who chose sovereignty over submission. With Cleopatra's passing, the curtain fell on more than a reign. It marked the end of a civilization's independence that had endured for thousands of years. Egypt, once the land of pyramids, pharaohs, and gods who walked among mortals, was now absorbed into Rome's vast dominion. Octavian, soon to be named Augustus, took control of the Nile's immense wealth, securing grain shipments that would feed his empire and strengthen his authority. For the people of Egypt, life continued in the rhythms of the river, the planting, the harvest, the festivals honouring ancient deities, but beneath the surface, everything had changed. No longer was their ruler a descendant of pharaohs. Their queen was gone, and their destiny now lay in the hands of foreigners. Cleopatra's children carried the fragile threads of her legacy. The twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, along with their younger brother Ptolemy Philadelphus, were taken to Rome. There they walked in Octavian's triumphal procession, not as sovereign heirs, but as ornaments of victory. For a moment, the world saw in them the last remnants of Egypt's dynasty, dressed in finery yet bound by conquest. Caesarion, the boy Cleopatra had declared as son of Caesar and heir of both worlds, was not granted even this bitter fate. His death ensured that no living rival to Octavian could claim Caesar's name. Yet Cleopatra Selene, the daughter, would carry forward a fragment of her mother's vision. Married to King Juba Seku of Mauritania, she became a queen in her own right, ruling far from the Nile but bringing with her the culture, knowledge, and spirit of Alexandria. Through her, Cleopatra's lineage did not vanish entirely, but continued to influence distant courts. In Egypt itself, the transformation was profound. Roman governors replaced the pharaoh's court, legions replaced palace guards, and the temples of old gods were maintained but increasingly overshadowed by imperial authority. The Library of Alexandria, once the symbol of global knowledge, entered a long twilight, its decline reflecting the shift of power from Egypt to Rome. And yet, Cleopatra's memory lingered. To her people, she remained the embodiment of Isis, a queen who had defended Egypt until the very end. To Rome, she was a figure of fascination, reviled as a seductress yet admired for her intellect and audacity. Poets and historians could not resist her story, painting her alternately as a villain who ensnared great men or as a tragic heroine whose fall marked the passing of an age. Over time, her image transcended politics. She became a legend, her life retold in plays, poems, and tales whispered across generations. The last pharaoh was no longer merely a ruler of flesh and blood, but a symbol of resilience, allure, and destiny. Though Egypt had lost its sovereignty, Cleopatra ensured that its spirit wrapped in her story would never be forgotten. In the years that followed Cleopatra's death, her legend began to evolve almost immediately, shaped by both admiration and propaganda. Octavian, now Augustus, sought to present himself as the saviour of Rome who had freed the Republic from the influence of a dangerous foreign queen. In his narrative, Cleopatra became the villain, the cunning temptress who had corrupted Antony and nearly led Rome into ruin. Roman poets and historians echoed this portrayal, describing her with words that mixed fear and fascination. Yet even as they sought to diminish her, their words ensured she was remembered. The image of Cleopatra lingered in the Roman imagination, a queen whose beauty was matched by intelligence, whose ambitions threatened the world's greatest empire. Over time, the narrative softened. Later generations, distanced from Rome's political battles, began to see her not only as a temptress, but as a woman of brilliance who dared to challenge Rome at its height. In Alexandria, memories of her reign endured in quieter ways. The temples she had restored still bore inscriptions linking her to Isis, and the people remembered her processions along the Nile, radiant and commanding. Merchants recalled the prosperity her policies had brought, while scholars spoke of her mastery of languages and her presence among philosophers. To them, Cleopatra was more than the Romans' caricature. She was a monarch who had lived fully in the traditions of Egypt while navigating the storms of Rome. Her daughter, Cleopatra Selene, carried fragments of this memory to Mauritania, where she and her husband ruled with grace. In their court, echoes of Alexandria's culture found new life. Architecture inspired by the Nile, coins stamped with symbols of Egyptian heritage, and the wisdom of scholars who had once walked in the shadow of the library. Through her, the spirit of her mother reached distant shores, ensuring that Cleopatra's influence was not buried with her in the mausoleum. Meanwhile, in Rome itself, Cleopatra's tale inspired endless curiosity. Artists painted her death as a dramatic scene with the serpent at her breast. Poets wove her into their verses, and audiences marvelled at the story of the queen who defied an empire. For Augustus, this fascination was a reminder that even in death, Cleopatra rivaled him in fame. She had denied him the triumph of parading her in chains, and instead she remained immortalized on her own terms. As centuries passed, her legend only grew. Historians debated her choices, playwrights reimagined her romance with Antony, and storytellers wove her life into myth. Each version revealed as much about the time in which it was told as it did about the queen herself. Cleopatra had become more than history. She had become an eternal symbol of power, passion, and defiance. Her life, and her end, continued to shape the way the world remembered the fall of Egypt's last pharaoh. The centuries after Cleopatra's death transformed her into a figure who lived as much in imagination as in history. Writers of Rome emphasized her role as a foreign queen, whose allure nearly brought down their republic, yet with every account her legend deepened. Plutarch, writing more than a century later, insisted that her charm lay not only in beauty but in intellect, in the power of her presence and voice. He described how her conversations could captivate the most hardened of men, how her wit and quick mind created a magnetism far stronger than appearance alone. This image contrasted with Roman propaganda, revealing the complexity of a woman who had defied simple categorization. In Egypt, the memory of Cleopatra endured in more subtle ways. Though Roman governors now ruled, the temple still whispered her name in rituals, and the common people remembered her processions where she had appeared as Isis reborn. Farmers along the Nile spoke of the years of plenty during her reign, recalling her as a ruler who had embraced their language and honoured their gods unlike the Ptolemies before her. For them, Cleopatra was not the villain painted by Rome, but a pharaoh who belonged to Egypt. As time passed and the empire shifted, her story travelled far beyond the Mediterranean. Arab scholars preserved fragments of her legacy, weaving her into tales of science, medicine, and alchemy, portraying her as a woman of knowledge as much as power. In Europe during the Renaissance, Cleopatra re-emerged as a symbol of both danger and fascination. Artists painted her death with dramatic flourish, the serpent coiled against her arm, the queen serene in her final moments. Playwrights told her story as tragedy, shaping her into an archetype of love, ambition, and fate. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra immortalized her as larger than life, a woman who embodied both passion and grandeur, ensuring that audiences centuries later still felt the pull of her presence. Every age remade Cleopatra in its own image. To some, she was the dangerous seductress, to others, the tragic heroine, to still others, a visionary queen who stood against the tide of empire. Yet through all these interpretations, one truth remained constant. Cleopatra could never be forgotten. Her story was too vivid, her choices too bold, her end too unforgettable. She had shaped not only the destiny of Egypt, but the imagination of the world, becoming a symbol of sovereignty, resilience, and the eternal human struggle against forces greater than oneself. Cleopatra's story endures because it sits at the crossroads of myth and reality, history and legend. Unlike many rulers of her age, she was not defined solely by battles or conquests, but by her ability to shape perception, to weave identity into power. She was a queen fluent in languages, able to converse with diplomats from distant lands without an interpreter. She was a strategist who understood that alliances could be forged not only with armies, but with intellect, charm, and calculated gestures. In a world dominated by men, she carved out authority through sheer presence, positioning herself not as a consort but as a sovereign in her own right. The survival of Egypt during the rise of Rome was no small achievement, and much of it came from her ability to read the shifting tides of politics. When her dynasty teetered on collapse, she aligned with Caesar. When Caesar fell, she turned to Antony. Each decision was controversial, yet each was guided by the urgent need to protect her throne and her people from becoming mere subjects of Rome. Her choices reveal the burden of ruling at the edge of empire, where survival demanded both courage and compromise. Even in her death, Cleopatra asserted control. By choosing the moment and the manner of her passing, she denied Octavian the spectacle of her humiliation. In this way, she transformed defeat into defiance, ensuring that her legacy would not be one of submission, but of sovereignty to the very end. That act of final agency resonates across time, reminding us that history is not only about victories, but also about the dignity with which one faces loss. For modern readers, Cleopatra embodies contradictions. She was both pragmatic and idealistic, calculating and passionate, mortal yet divine in the eyes of her people. These contradictions make her real, make her human, and yet elevate her into the realm of legend. Artists and writers through the ages have seized upon these qualities, for they reflect universal struggles, love and power, loyalty and betrayal, triumph and tragedy. To study Cleopatra is to see not only a queen of ancient Egypt, but a mirror of human ambition and resilience. Her life was a tapestry woven from threads of politics, culture, and myth, and though the fabric of her kingdom was eventually torn apart, the pattern she created continues to captivate. In every retelling, she emerges not simply as the last pharaoh, but as a timeless figure who shaped destiny through vision, courage, and the refusal to be silenced by defeat. To understand Cleopatra's enduring significance, one must look beyond the dramatic end and consider the foundation she laid throughout her reign. Unlike many monarchs of her dynasty, she embraced the Egyptian identity fully, speaking the language of her people and adopting their customs. This was not merely symbolic, but deeply political. By appearing as Isis in ceremonies and honouring Egyptian traditions, she legitimized her rule among those who might have otherwise seen the Ptolemies as foreign overlords. Her reign was also marked by pragmatic governance. She strengthened Egypt's economy through trade, ensuring that Alexandria remained a hub of commerce and culture. The city's position along the Mediterranean made it a crossroads of knowledge, and under Cleopatra, scholars and philosophers continued to thrive, even as Rome's shadow grew darker. She valued learning, surrounding herself with advisors skilled in science, medicine, and rhetoric, making her court not only a place of politics, but of ideas. Cleopatra also demonstrated remarkable resilience in diplomacy. She faced betrayals within her own family, exile from her throne, and the constant threat of Rome's intervention, yet she always returned stronger. Her ability to adapt to shifting political landscapes was perhaps her greatest skill. Where others might have been crushed by circumstance, she transformed obstacles into opportunities, aligning herself with Caesar and later Antony to secure Egypt's place in a dangerous world. Critics, both ancient and modern, often reduce her to the role of seductress, but this perspective dismisses the complexity of her strategies. Cleopatra used every tool at her disposal, including charisma, intellect, and pageantry, to maintain sovereignty for her people. Her relationships with Caesar and Antony were not mere romances, but calculated alliances forged in a crucible of survival. Through them, she sought not only personal security, but also the continuation of Egypt as a power that could influence Rome rather than be consumed by it. In this light, Cleopatra emerges not as a passive figure swept up in the tides of empire, but as an active shaper of events, a ruler who dared to challenge the trajectory of history. Her legacy, then, lies not only in the empire she lost, but in the example she set. A woman in a patriarchal world who commanded armies, governed a nation, and faced the greatest empire of her age with unwavering determination. This is why her story continues to fascinate. It speaks to the eternal human desire to assert identity and destiny, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Cleopatra's reign also reveals much about the interplay between culture and power. At a time when Rome sought to impose its influence across the Mediterranean, Cleopatra preserved Egypt's distinct identity, blending Ptolemaic traditions with those of the Nile. Her court in Alexandria reflected this synthesis. Greek philosophers debated with Egyptian priests. Artisans crafted works that combined Hellenistic detail with native symbolism, and festivals honoured both the gods of old and the ideals of a cosmopolitan city. This blending was not accidental. It was a deliberate effort to present Egypt as both timeless and adaptable, ancient yet modern in the eyes of the world. Cleopatra herself was the centrepiece of this cultural tapestry. In official portraits she wore Egyptian crowns, yet coins bore her likeness in the Hellenistic style, projecting authority to different audiences. She understood that power was not only about armies, but about image, and she mastered the art of appearing as many things at once: goddess, mother, scholar, diplomat. This versatility allowed her to command respect across cultures, making her one of the most cosmopolitan rulers of antiquity. Her policies also demonstrated foresight. By strengthening trade routes through the Red Sea and aligning with Arabian markets, she secured resources that Rome itself coveted. Spices, incense, and precious goods flowed into Alexandria, making the city a jewel of commerce and ensuring Egypt remained indispensable. Such pragmatism, combined with her charisma, gave Cleopatra leverage even in negotiations with men as powerful as Caesar and Antony. Yet behind these successes was a ruler deeply attuned to the fragility of her position. She knew that Egypt, despite its wealth, could not match Rome's legions. Thus, she relied on diplomacy, spectacle, and intelligence as her greatest weapons. Her banquets, her carefully staged appearances as Isis, and her eloquence in many languages all served as tools of influence. They created an aura that even her enemies could not ignore. For her subjects, this aura fostered pride and continuity. For Rome, it inspired both admiration and fear. The duality of her image ensured that she would never be dismissed as ordinary. Instead, she stood as both Egypt's protector and Rome's rival, embodying the paradox of a queen whose power extended far beyond her borders. In every gesture and decision, Cleopatra demonstrated that identity could be as formidable as armies, and that culture itself could be wielded as a shield against conquest. This understanding of soft power was centuries ahead of its time, securing her place not just as the last pharaoh, but as one of history's most visionary rulers. Cleopatra's legacy also lies in the way she navigated the expectations of gender in her world. In an era when women were rarely seen as sovereign rulers, she assumed the full powers of pharaoh, commanding armies, overseeing trade, and engaging in diplomacy at the highest levels. Her ability to do so was not only a matter of lineage, but of personal skill. She cultivated an image that merged femininity with authority, embodying Isis as the divine mother while simultaneously ruling with the pragmatism of a seasoned monarch. This duality gave her strength. To her people, she was nurturing and sacred. To her rivals, she was formidable and strategic. In doing so, she redefined what it meant to be a queen in a patriarchal age. Ancient writers often tried to diminish her achievements by focusing on her relationships with powerful men. Yet those alliances were not signs of weakness, but of political acumen. Cleopatra understood that in a world dominated by Rome, personal ties to Caesar and Antony offered Egypt its best chance at survival. She used intimacy not as surrender, but as a tool of negotiation, securing resources, legitimacy, and protection for her kingdom. It is telling that even her detractors admitted her intelligence was as captivating as her presence. Plutarch described her voice as capable of moving hearts, her words carefully chosen to adapt to each listener. She could disarm hostility, inspire loyalty, and plant seeds of ambition in those around her. Such command over language and psychology was as vital as any weapon in her arsenal. Beyond politics, Cleopatra also had to ensure the stability of daily life in Egypt. She maintained the irrigation systems of the Nile, vital for grain harvests, and oversaw tax reforms to keep her economy stable. These measures, less glamorous than her famous banquets or alliances, were essential to keeping Egypt prosperous under constant pressure from Rome. Her subjects experienced her not only as a figure of spectacle, but as a ruler who safeguarded their livelihoods. By balancing spectacle with substance, she reinforced her legitimacy. The symbolism of her public appearances as Isis reassured the masses of divine continuity, while her practical governance ensured their survival. This combination made her reign distinct. She was both myth and manager, a queen who lived in two worlds at once. In the end, her ability to occupy these roles simultaneously is what ensured her story endured. She was never merely a partner to Caesar or Antony, nor simply the last pharaoh in a fading dynasty. She was Cleopatra, a woman who defied convention, claimed her own authority, and left behind a legacy that transcends the ruins of empires. Cleopatra's reign also highlights the delicate balance between tradition and innovation. As the last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, she inherited a throne shaped by Greek heritage, yet rooted in the soil of ancient Egypt. Rather than choose one identity over the other, she embraced both. In ceremonies, she wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, invoking the pharaohs who had reigned for millennia, while in her coinage and diplomatic portraits she adopted Greek styles that spoke to allies across the Mediterranean. This duality was deliberate, for Cleopatra understood that power depended on bridging cultures. To the Egyptian priesthood, she was the living Isis, daughter of the Nile, guardian of the temples. To Greek scholars and merchants, she was a learned monarch fluent in their tongue, patron of philosophy and science. In this way, she bound her diverse subjects together, creating unity where division might have weakened her. Alexandria under her rule reflected this harmony. The city thrived as a mosaic of languages, religions, and traditions. Its harbour welcomed ships from Africa, Arabia, and Europe, carrying goods that enriched its markets and ideas that enlivened its debates. Within its palaces, Cleopatra presided over discussions of medicine, astronomy, and mathematics, drawing on the talents of scholars who flocked to the famed library. This intellectual vitality was not mere ornament but a tool of governance, for knowledge was power as surely as armies were. Cleopatra's patronage of learning demonstrated her foresight, showing that a queen's strength could be measured not only in battles but in the wisdom she cultivated. Yet even as she honoured tradition, she adapted to the realities of her age. Rome's dominance could not be denied, and so she played the game of diplomacy with brilliance. By aligning with Caesar and Antony, she preserved Egypt's sovereignty far longer than might otherwise have been possible. Each alliance was a gamble, but each reflected her determination to protect her people from being swallowed by empire. Some historians judge her harshly for tying her fate to Rome's men, yet in truth she had few alternatives. Her choices were not those of luxury but of necessity, made in the crucible of survival. And though Rome eventually triumphed, Cleopatra ensured that Egypt's final chapter as an independent kingdom was written with dignity. Her reign was not one of passive decline, but of active resistance, marked by vision, adaptation, and courage. In blending the old with the new, she showed that leadership meant more than clinging to the past. It meant shaping the present into something worthy of remembrance. The story of Cleopatra is also the story of Alexandria, the dazzling city that stood as a beacon of culture at the edge of empire. Founded by Alexander the Great, it was designed to embody the blending of worlds, and under Cleopatra it reached its last great moment of glory. The city's wide avenues and marble colonnades shone in the Mediterranean sun, its harbour alive with ships bearing spices, grain, and silks from distant lands. The lighthouse of Pharos, one of the seven wonders, guided travellers toward its bustling quays, while the great library, though diminished from its peak, remained a symbol of human curiosity and ambition. Cleopatra made Alexandria her stage, understanding that the city itself was an extension of her power. Here she entertained Caesar and Antony, dazzling them with feasts that combined Egyptian ceremony with Greek spectacle. Here she received diplomats, merchants, and philosophers, offering them not just politics but an immersion into a culture that was at once ancient and modern. In these halls, knowledge was exchanged as freely as goods, and Cleopatra presided not only as queen but as patron of learning. She encouraged the study of medicine, astronomy, and languages, ensuring that Alexandria remained the intellectual heart of the Mediterranean. To her, scholarship was more than prestige. It was a tool to strengthen Egypt's position in a world dominated by Rome. The scholars she gathered could advise on trade routes, interpret omens, or craft remedies, all of which reinforced her rule. The city's temples further anchored her authority. By appearing in processions as Isis, accompanied by music, incense, and offerings, Cleopatra tied her identity to the divine, linking her reign to the eternal rhythms of the Nile. These ceremonies reminded her people that she was not merely a monarch imposed by dynastic fortune, but a chosen guardian of Egypt's gods and traditions. At the same time, her coinage projected a different image abroad. Struck with her profile in the style of Greek rulers, these coins circulated across the Mediterranean, carrying her likeness into the hands of soldiers and merchants. Thus, Alexandria became both her sanctuary and her platform, the place where she blended image, intellect, and influence. Even as Rome's shadow lengthened, the city reflected Cleopatra's vision of what Egypt could be: proud, cultured, resilient, and radiant. The fate of Alexandria would change after her death, but in her lifetime it stood as a living testament to her dream of an Egypt that commanded not only land and wealth, but imagination itself. Cleopatra's vision of leadership also reveals her profound understanding of symbolism. She knew that in the theatre of politics, perception could be as powerful as armies, and so she mastered the art of spectacle. When she met Caesar, her dramatic entrance wrapped in a carpet became legend, not only because of its daring but because it conveyed a message. She was not a supplicant but a queen worthy of attention. When she sailed to Tarsus to meet Antony, her golden barge with purple sails and incense-filled air turned diplomacy into myth, presenting herself as Isis incarnate. These gestures were not excess. They were deliberate performances designed to frame her authority. By controlling the stage, Cleopatra controlled the narrative. This mastery extended to her public image at home. Processions through Alexandria displayed her as divine, while her governance demonstrated pragmatism. She balanced the grandeur of ceremony with the daily realities of ruling, overseeing harvests, taxes, and the maintenance of temples and canals. Her people saw in her not only a figure of splendour, but also a ruler attentive to their needs. This duality gave her reign depth, making her more than an image on coins or a figure in rituals. She was present in the lives of her subjects, both spiritually and practically. Beyond Egypt, Cleopatra's symbolic power unsettled Rome. To Octavian, she represented a rival narrative, one in which Antony and Cleopatra envisioned a dynasty uniting East and West. The public crowning of their children was a direct challenge, declaring that new rulers would emerge outside of Rome's control. For Octavian, such symbolism had to be destroyed, for in politics stories often matter more than facts. Cleopatra understood this as well, which is why her final act, choosing death rather than humiliation, resonated so profoundly. By denying Octavian the spectacle of her capture, she rewrote the ending of her story. Instead of appearing as a conquered queen paraded in chains, she became the sovereign who claimed her destiny, transforming loss into defiance. This ability to wield symbolism with precision explains why her legend endured long after her dynasty ended. Writers, poets, and artists found in her a figure larger than history, a queen who moved between reality and myth with seamless grace. She had shown that power was not only the command of armies, but the command of meaning itself. In every gesture, Cleopatra created symbols that transcended time, ensuring that her life would echo through centuries as both history and story. Cleopatra's ability to blend politics with performance reflected a deep awareness of human nature. She recognized that rulers were remembered not simply for victories, but for the stories that outlived them, and she shaped her reign with this truth in mind. Every alliance, every procession, every carefully chosen word was part of a larger narrative she wove for her people and for the world beyond Egypt's borders. Her banquets were not merely indulgences, but stages where power was displayed in gold and music, where diplomacy flowed as freely as wine, and where Rome's envoys could not help but be impressed by Egypt's magnificence. In those moments, Cleopatra demonstrated that influence could be won by wonder as surely as by war. Yet beneath the splendour lay pragmatism. She knew her kingdom's strength lay in its grain, the harvest of the Nile that fed not only Egyptians but Romans as well. By controlling this lifeline, she gave Egypt leverage that no general could ignore. Ships laden with grain sailed from Alexandria to Rome, carrying with them the quiet reminder that Cleopatra's land sustained the Republic. This economic power gave her a voice in Rome's politics, for no matter how they mocked or maligned her, they could not dismiss the wealth she controlled. At the same time, Cleopatra nurtured Egypt's spiritual life. She restored temples, honoured ancient festivals, and presented herself as the living embodiment of Isis, linking her authority to the divine. This spiritual connection was not empty symbolism, but a way of binding her people to her rule. They saw in her the sacred continuity of their heritage, and this trust sustained her throne even as Roman legions drew near. Her reign, therefore, was not simply about resisting Rome, but about affirming Egypt's identity in its final independent chapter. That she managed to keep her kingdom sovereign for nearly 2 decades against the backdrop of Rome's expansion is a testament to her resilience and vision. When the end came, it was not because she lacked wisdom or courage, but because the tide of empire was unstoppable. Rome consumed all before it, and yet Cleopatra ensured that Egypt's last stand was not one of quiet surrender, but of brilliance, courage, and choice. She made herself unforgettable, and in doing so she preserved Egypt's voice in history. Though her dynasty fell, her story became the prism through which the world remembered the grandeur of the Nile. By uniting politics, culture, economy, and faith into one vision, Cleopatra created a legacy so powerful that no conqueror could erase it, a legend that would echo long after the stones of her palace had crumbled into the sea. The centuries that followed Cleopatra's death turned her into more than a historical figure. She became a mirror through which each generation reflected its own ideas of power, love, and ambition. To the Romans who celebrated Octavian's triumph, she was the dangerous queen whose downfall proved the strength of their new empire. To poets like Virgil and Horace, she embodied both fascination and fear, a foreign enchantress who threatened Roman virtue. Yet even within their condemnation, there lingered a recognition of her grandeur, an acknowledgement that she had stood as a formidable rival. Later historians such as Plutarch offered a more balanced view, emphasizing her intelligence, wit, and presence, rather than relying solely on tales of beauty. He described how her conversation was irresistible, her voice musical, her adaptability unmatched, painting her as a woman who could disarm with words as much as with charm. In the Middle Ages, her story was reshaped through moral lessons, often framed as a warning against the dangers of passion and ambition. Yet even then, the allure of her end, the image of the queen with the asp, captivated imaginations. With the Renaissance came a rebirth of interest in antiquity, and Cleopatra's legend flourished anew. Artists painted her as the epitome of tragic beauty, scholars debated her choices, and playwrights immortalized her in words. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra transformed her into a character of enduring complexity, passionate yet cunning, regal yet vulnerable, commanding yet human. This portrayal ensured that her story would echo not only in historical chronicles, but on the world stages, where audiences would continue to wrestle with her contradictions. In the centuries that followed, Cleopatra became a symbol of female authority in a male-dominated past. Romantic poets of the 19th century saw in her the tragic heroine undone by love, while modern interpreters recast her as a visionary who resisted imperial domination. Each retelling shaped her anew, yet all agreed on one truth: she could not be ignored. Her name carried weight, her story demanded attention, her choices sparked debate. No pharaoh before her, and no ruler after, captured the imagination of so many cultures for so many centuries. In this way, Cleopatra achieved in death what few conquerors achieved in life: immortality in memory. The sands of Egypt buried countless kings and dynasties, but Cleopatra rose above time itself. She became not only the last pharaoh of Egypt, but a figure who transcended her age, embodying themes of resilience, sovereignty, and defiance that continue to resonate across the world. Cleopatra's legend also reflects the enduring power of storytelling itself. From the moment of her death, her image began to shift, moulded by poets, historians, and artists who each emphasized different aspects of her life. The Romans shaped her into a warning, proof of Octavian's triumph and the dangers of foreign queens. The Greeks remembered her intellect and wit, marvelling at how she bridged cultures. Later generations reimagined her as a symbol of passion, tragedy, or defiance. This constant reinvention ensured that she never faded into obscurity. For every era found something in her story that spoke to its own fears and desires. In this way, Cleopatra achieved what she had always sought: immortality, not in flesh but in memory. The fascination lay not only in her romances or her dramatic death, but in her ability to stand at the crossroads of two worlds. She was at once Greek and Egyptian, monarch and mother, goddess and mortal, lover and strategist. This complexity defied simple labels, making her endlessly intriguing. Even today, debates continue. Was she primarily a political genius or a manipulator, a patriot or an opportunist, a tragic victim or a calculating survivor? The truth, as always, lies in the blend of these identities, for Cleopatra embodied contradictions and made them her strength. She wielded beauty as a tool but relied on intellect as her weapon. She staged spectacles but backed them with sound governance. She loved deeply, yet never lost sight of her duty to protect Egypt's sovereignty. This layered identity is why her story has outlasted countless rulers who commanded greater armies or built larger monuments. Few names from antiquity stir the imagination as hers does, and fewer still inspire such varied interpretations across cultures and centuries. In literature, she became the archetype of the queen who defies empire. In art, the image of tragic beauty. In politics, an example of female authority in a male-dominated world. Every retelling adds another thread to the tapestry of her legend, but the fabric remains woven around the same core. A woman who dared to shape her own destiny against impossible odds. Through this, Cleopatra's life reminds us that history is not only about conquest, but about legacy, about the ability to inspire beyond one's time. Empires rose and fell, Rome itself transformed into dust, yet Cleopatra's name endured, glowing like a flame carried across generations, illuminating the past and sparking the imagination of the future. Cleopatra's enduring allure also lies in how she represents the meeting of power and humanity. Though she lived as a queen, her story is told as that of a woman who faced choices between survival and surrender, love and duty, ambition and legacy. This human dimension has kept her legend alive in ways that purely political rulers seldom achieve. People see in her both the majesty of a pharaoh and the vulnerability of an individual navigating impossible pressures. Her romances with Caesar and Antony, though often exaggerated, highlight the duality of her role. Alliances essential for Egypt's survival became stories of passion retold for centuries. Yet behind the dramatization was a woman making decisions within the narrow path allowed by empire's shadow. What makes her extraordinary is that she turned those limitations into opportunities, asserting her will where history sought to erase her voice. Cleopatra also stands as a figure of resistance against imperial domination. To Rome, she was an obstacle, a rival whose very existence challenged their claim to universal power. By aligning with Antony, she symbolized an alternative future in which East and West might merge under a dynasty independent of Octavian. Though that vision failed at Actium, the mere possibility unsettled Rome deeply enough that her downfall had to be dramatized as inevitable. In that sense, her life reminds us that history is written not only by victors, but also by those they sought to suppress. Cleopatra's refusal to be reduced to a footnote ensured that her memory survived even in hostile accounts. Her final act of choosing death over humiliation has become a timeless gesture of sovereignty, echoed in countless retellings as the ultimate statement of dignity. Even today, artists, filmmakers, and writers return to her story not because of military victories or monuments, but because she embodies timeless questions. How does one preserve identity against overwhelming force? How does one balance love and power? How does one remain sovereign in a world determined to conquer? These questions transcend antiquity, making Cleopatra relevant in every age. In her we see both the fragility of human ambition and the strength of human will. That paradox explains why her shadow stretches across 2,000 years, why her story has never grown old, and why the queen who ruled at the edge of Rome's empire continues to rule in the realm of imagination. Cleopatra's reign can also be seen as the final flowering of Egypt's ancient monarchy, a bridge between the world of the pharaohs and the era of Rome. She was not simply the last of the Ptolemies, but the last in a line of rulers stretching back to the dawn of recorded history, inheriting traditions that had endured for 3 millennia. When she appeared in temple rituals as Isis, she was drawing on a continuity that linked her to figures like Hatshepsut and Nefertiti, women who had also ruled in male-dominated times. Yet unlike those queens, Cleopatra faced a world transformed by the dominance of Rome. Her challenge was not to maintain an empire already strong, but to preserve independence in the shadow of a rising superpower. That she managed to keep Egypt sovereign for nearly 2 decades is itself remarkable. She combined ancient rituals with modern politics, embodying both the grandeur of tradition and the flexibility of adaptation. Her Alexandria was not only a centre of Egyptian culture, but also a cosmopolitan hub where Greek, Egyptian, and Roman influences intertwined. This blend reflected her strategy, to make Egypt indispensable, not only as a source of grain, but as a centre of knowledge and exchange. Her ability to merge old and new made her more than a relic of a dying dynasty. It made her a pioneer of cultural synthesis. Cleopatra's death, however, closed this chapter. With her passing, the divine aura of the pharaohs dissolved, replaced by Roman governors who ruled not as gods but as administrators. The temple still stood, the Nile still flowed, but the sense of Egypt as a sovereign universe diminished. This contrast between her life and what followed heightened her legend. She became the embodiment of a lost world, the last voice of an ancient tradition silenced by conquest. For Egyptians living under Rome, memories of her reign must have carried both pride and sorrow. Pride that their last queen had stood defiantly against Rome. sorrow that her death marked the end of independence. For later generations, Cleopatra became a symbol of transition, a reminder that civilizations do not end with a single battle, but with the passing of eras. Her life encapsulated the twilight of pharaonic Egypt, glowing with brilliance even as the night of Roman domination approached. And because she shone so brightly in those final moments, her name survived where others were forgotten, ensuring that Egypt's ancient voice would echo far beyond its fall. Cleopatra's story also speaks to the universal theme of identity in a world of shifting powers. She was born into a dynasty of Greek origin, yet chose to embrace the culture of the Nile, becoming the first of her line to speak Egyptian fluently and to present herself as truly native. In this, she transcended the divisions between conqueror and conquered, forging an identity that bound her to her people. This decision was not cosmetic. It was strategic and heartfelt, a recognition that legitimacy required more than lineage. By uniting Ptolemaic and Egyptian traditions, she stood not as an outsider, but as a queen who carried the soul of her kingdom. This identity gave her strength in diplomacy as well. When she spoke with foreign rulers, she could adapt to their language and customs, shifting seamlessly between Greek, Egyptian, and other tongues. She embodied the idea that power flowed not only from armies, but from the ability to connect across boundaries. Her polyglot skills and cultural fluency were as essential to her reign as the treasures of the Nile. In this way, she became a bridge between civilizations, her court a place where worlds converged. This fusion of identities also explains why she resonated so deeply beyond her lifetime. To Romans, she was foreign yet familiar, a queen who reflected their own love of spectacle and grandeur even as she opposed them. To Egyptians, she was the daughter of Isis, sacred and enduring. To later historians and artists, she was the embodiment of complexity itself, Greek by blood, Egyptian by choice, global in outlook. In an age when borders were redrawn by conquest, Cleopatra asserted that identity could be fluid, powerful, and chosen. Her decision to root herself in Egypt's traditions preserved continuity in a time of upheaval, and her ability to adapt made her story relevant across cultures. Even her death reflected this duality, combining Egyptian symbolism with Hellenistic drama, leaving behind an ending that transcended cultural lines. Through this, she became timeless. Cleopatra's life reminds us that identity is not fixed but forged, not inherited but created through choices. Her reign shows that by embracing complexity rather than denying it, a leader can wield influence that endures far beyond political defeat. In her, we see the possibility of belonging to many worlds at once, of embodying contradictions without being diminished by them. That lesson, as much as her political achievements, explains why her name continues to inspire awe 2,000 years after her final breath. Cleopatra's tale also reminds us that history is shaped not only by events, but by the way those events are remembered. Her defeat at Actium, Antony's death, and her own choice to end her life could have consigned her to the role of a tragic footnote, yet instead they elevated her into myth. This transformation was not accidental. It was the result of her lifelong mastery of image. She understood that legacy mattered as much as survival, and so she crafted symbols that would outlive her. The goddess Isis reborn, the queen who spoke to her people in their own tongue, the monarch who dared to challenge Rome itself. These images endured even as Rome tried to frame her as dangerous and decadent. By controlling the stage of her final act, Cleopatra ensured that she would never be remembered as a captive, but as a sovereign who chose dignity over humiliation. This act of narrative control is why her name resonates more powerfully than many of her conquerors. How many remember the details of Octavian's campaigns, and how many remember Cleopatra's serpent and crown? She demonstrated that memory can be as lasting a weapon as steel. In this sense, she remains one of history's greatest storytellers, not only in words but in deeds. Her legend also underscores the tension between truth and myth. Was she truly the seductress Rome portrayed, or the stateswoman Plutarch admired? Was her death by asp, fact, or poetic invention? These uncertainties fuel fascination, for in Cleopatra we see both history and imagination entwined. Every generation projects onto her its own fears, desires, and ideals, ensuring she's never static but always alive. That is why she appears in Shakespeare's verse, in Renaissance paintings, in Hollywood films, in modern novels, each time reborn, each time reshaped, yet always commanding attention. She remains relevant because she was never only one thing. She was queen and woman, strategist and lover, victor and victim, human and divine. This multifaceted identity ensures that her story can be told endlessly, without ever exhausting its meaning. As the sands of time erased the palaces of Alexandria and the tomb of Cleopatra was lost, her image grew brighter, proving that monuments are not the only way to achieve immortality. Sometimes it is the story itself, carried across centuries, that endures, and Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, ensured that her story would never fade, that her name would echo long after empires turned to dust. Cleopatra's story closes not with silence, but with an echo that has carried through 2,000 years, a reminder that the measure of a life is not only in victories won, but in the legacy left behind. She stood as the last pharaoh of a land that had once built pyramids, carved temples into stone cliffs, and watched the Nile flow in eternal rhythm. Her reign marked the twilight of that ancient glory, yet she ensured that Egypt's light did not simply fade but flared brilliantly one last time. By embracing her people's traditions, by mastering the languages of neighbours and rivals, by daring to engage with the most powerful men of her age, she showed that identity and vision could be weapons as sharp as swords. Her end was tragic, yet it was chosen, an act of sovereignty that denied Rome the triumph of humiliation. In that moment she transformed from queen into legend, and legend into symbol. For generations she has embodied resilience against overwhelming odds, the blending of cultures, the assertion of dignity in the face of conquest. Rome absorbed Egypt, Octavian became Augustus, empires rose and fell, but Cleopatra remained, her name alive in chronicles, in art, in poetry, in the imaginations of those who sought to understand power and passion. She's remembered not merely as a lover of Caesar and Antony, but as a ruler who held her ground when the world shifted beneath her. Her life reminds us that greatness does not lie in avoiding defeat, but in shaping destiny with courage, vision, and choice. Cleopatra lives on because she touched something eternal, the human desire to be remembered not as a victim of history, but as a maker of it. And so her legacy endures, shimmering like the sun on the Nile, reminding us that even when kingdoms crumble, stories endure. She was Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, who shaped an empire's destiny and claimed immortality in the hearts of all who hear her name.